Welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something that I think a lot of business leaders struggle with, and that's how to procure market research services.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge.
It can be really tough. So hopefully we can shed some light on the topic and, help people get the most out of their market research.
Absolutely. And avoid some of those common pitfalls.
Yeah, for sure. And, when we were getting ready for this episode, I came across a source that described market research as the lifeline of a business.
Interesting.
What do you think about that analogy?
You know, I think it's pretty accurate when you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, in today's business world, things are changing so rapidly.
Right.
You really need to have your finger on the pulse of the market to be successful. You need to understand your customers, your competitors, the overall landscape, or you're going to be operating in the dark.
Yeah, and nobody wants to be operating in the dark. So let's talk about how to actually go about procuring market research services. This source we're looking at breaks the process down into four key stages, the first one being identification.
Okay.
So let's start there.
All right. So when you're thinking about identifying potential market research providers, it's important to remember there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
You've got these big global firms that offer a wide range of services, and then you've got smaller, specialized agencies that focus on a specific niche or industry.
So how do you figure out which type of provider is right for your business?
Well, one way to approach it is to think about what you're not looking for.
Okay.
For example, if you're a tech startup, a massive firm with a broad, generalized approach might not be the best fit. You might be better off with a provider that really understands the tech sector and the challenges that tech startups face.
So it's about aligning your specific needs with the expertise of the provider.
Exactly. You want to make sure that the provider you choose has a deep understanding of your industry and your business goals.
Right. So it sounds like it's kind of a matchmaking process.
You could say that.
All right, so once you've identified some potential providers, the next step is evaluation.
Right.
So how do you actually evaluate these providers and figure out if they can really deliver what they promise?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't be afraid to ask tough questions about their methodologies.
Like what kind of questions?
Well, for example, it's not enough to just know whether they lean towards qualitative or quantitative research. You want to dig deeper and understand what specific techniques they use.
Okay.
Like, do they have experience with things like conjoint analysis or ethnographic research, which can be really valuable for understanding customer preferences and behavior.
So it's about going beyond those basic labels and really understanding the nuances of their approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what else should you be looking at during the evaluation process?
Well, technology is another important factor these days.
Right.
You want to make sure that the provider you're considering is using the latest and greatest tools and platforms.
So they're not stuck in the dark ages.
Exactly. You want to see that they're leveraging things like data visualization and that they have robust systems for data security and privacy.
So it's not just about the research expertise, it's also about their infrastructure and how they use technology to enhance their offerings.
That's right.
Okay, and what about reputation? Should you be looking at that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Reputation is crucial.
Yeah.
You want to look for providers that have a proven track record of success.
Okay, so how do you actually assess a provider's reputation?
Well, one way is to look for recognition from reputable industry organizations.
Okay.
You can also check out client testimonials and see what other people are saying about their experiences.
So it's like doing your due diligence before making a big purchase. You wouldn't buy a car without checking its safety rating, right?
Exactly. You want to be confident that you're partnering with a provider that can deliver on their promises.
Now, speaking of the team behind the research, how important is it to understand who will actually be working on your project?
Oh, that's a really good point. And it's something that a lot of people overlook.
Okay.
You want to know who's going to be handling your data, who's going to be conducting the analysis, and who's going to be communicating with you throughout the project.
Yeah, you don't want to be working with a bunch of rookies.
Right. You want to make sure that the team has the experience and the expertise to meet your needs.
It's like building a house. You want to be sure you have skilled architects and builders who can bring your vision to life.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so we've talked about identifying potential market research providers, and we've talked about evaluating them now. How do you actually transition from assessing to working with a provider?
Well, that brings us to the next stage, which is negotiation. And that's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm already nervous just thinking about it.
I know it can be a bit daunting, but don't worry. I'll walk you through it step by step.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to it. We'll see you in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. All right, so we've identified some promising market research providers. We've carefully evaluated their capabilities. Now comes the part that can make even the most seasoned business leader sweat a little.
Negotiation.
Exactly. It's like stage 3 of this whole process, and it's where we shift gears from assessment to action.
You know, it's funny you say sweat a little because it really can feel like walking a tightrope.
I know what you mean.
Trying to strike that balance between getting the best deal for your company and building a solid relationship with the provider.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about getting the lowest price. It's about creating a win-win situation.
So how do you define value when it comes to market research services?
Good question. Because value goes beyond just the price tag, right? It encompasses things like the quality of the insights, the expertise of the team, the responsiveness of the provider, their ability to really understand your specific needs and goals.
Okay, so let's say you're sitting down at the negotiating table with a provider. What are some practical tips our listeners can use to ensure they're getting the most value for their investment?
Well, first off, I'd say break down the core elements of the negotiation and make sure you're crystal clear on each one.
Okay, break it down for us. What are those core elements?
So you've got pricing, of course, but it's also about timelines, deliverables, and those sometimes dreaded terms of service.
Okay, let's unpack each of those, starting with pricing. What are some common mistakes people make when negotiating pricing?
One big one is fixating solely on the overall project cost without understanding the breakdown.
Okay,
You really want to dig into the details and get a clear picture of how that cost is structured.
so don't be afraid to ask for an itemized breakdown.
Exactly. Ask for a detailed quote that outlines the cost of each phase, any potential travel expenses, data processing fees, rush charges, all of that.
So transparency is key.
Absolutely no hidden surprises lurking in the fine print. And I'd also recommend asking about their pricing model up front. Do they charge a fixed fee, an hourly rate, or some combination of the two? Understanding how they structure their pricing can give you more leverage in the negotiation.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, now let's move on to timelines. What are some key considerations when negotiating project timelines?
Well, first and foremost, be realistic.
Okay.
Quality research takes time rushing the place. The process can lead to shortcuts and ultimately compromise the value of the insights you're paying for.
So don't fall into the trap of thinking faster is always better.
Exactly. You want to make sure that both you and the provider are aligned on realistic deadlines for each stage of the research.
So it's about having a shared understanding of the project roadmap and being mindful of potential delays or roadblocks that might pop up.
Right, and make sure to factor in things like internal reviews, any potential delays in data collection, and dependencies on other projects or stakeholders. You don't want to create unnecessary pressure.
Makes sense.
Right.
All right, let's move on to deliverables, which I know can often be a source of confusion and miscommunication.
Right. Definitely. It's crucial to be super clear on what exactly you'll be getting at the end of the project.
Okay, so what kind of questions should our listeners be asking about deliverables?
Will it be a comprehensive written report, a dynamic presentation, raw data sets, some combination of these?
Right, it's about aligning expectations from the get-go and making sure that the deliverables match how the listener plans to use the insights.
Exactly. And don't be shy about getting specific if you need the data presented in a certain format, or if you require interactive dashboards for data visualization, spell it out clearly in the contract.
So it's about avoiding those lost in translation moments where you end up with something that doesn't quite meet your needs.
You got it. Now, finally, let's touch on those often overlooked terms of service, which can have some pretty big implications down the line.
Okay, what are some red flags listeners should be aware of when reviewing the terms of service?
Pay close attention to clauses related to intellectual property rights, confidentiality, data security. Make sure that the agreement clearly outlines ownership of the data, who has access to it, and how it's going to be protected.
So it's not just about the research itself, but about safeguarding your company's sensitive information.
Absolutely. You want to make sure your data is in good hands, and I'd also recommend clarifying the process for handling any unexpected issues or disputes.
Oh, okay.
Having a clear resolution mechanism outlined in the contract can save a lot of headaches down the road.
So we've covered pricing timelines, deliverables, terms of service. That's a lot to juggle during the negotiation phase.
It is, but remember, negotiation is just the beginning of the journey, right?
Right. We still have to actually manage the relationship with the provider
Yeah.
and ensure everything runs smoothly.
That's exactly where we're headed next.
Yeah.
The management phase.
The relationship phase, as you called it earlier, I'm intrigued. Let's dive into that in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've made it through the jungle. We found our ideal market research provider.
Right.
We've negotiated a solid agreement. But now what?
Now the real work begins.
Right, because the research doesn't just magically appear on our desks.
Not quite.
Ah,
We spend so much time and energy on those initial stages, selecting the right provider, hammering out the details of the contract, but the management phase often gets overlooked.
it's almost like we think, okay, we've hired the experts, our job is done, but is it really?
Not even close. I'd argue that this final stage management is where the rubber truly meets the road. It's where the success of the entire project hinges.
Because even with the best provider in the world, things can still go wrong if the relationship isn't managed effectively.
Exactly. So let's talk about how to make this relationship phase as smooth and productive as possible. What are some practical steps our listeners can take to ensure a successful collaboration with their provider?
Okay, first and foremost, communication. Communication.
I've been sensing a theme here.
It's crucial. Establish clear communication channels and expectations right from the start.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, for starters, make sure you know who the main point of contact is on both sides. How often will you have check-in meetings or progress reports? What's the preferred method of communication for urgent matters? All of that.
So it's about setting those ground rules for interaction, making sure everyone's on the same page from the get-go.
Exactly. And beyond those formal channels, I'd encourage our listeners to foster a more open dialogue with their providers.
What do you mean by open dialogue?
Well, you want to create an environment where you feel comfortable asking questions, raising concerns, providing feedback throughout the entire project.
So it's not a set it and forget it scenario.
Not at all. It's an ongoing collaboration. You want the provider to feel like they're part of your team working towards a shared goal.
And that collaborative approach is especially important when it comes to data analysis and interpretation, right?
Absolutely, because data without context is just numbers.
Right. It's the interpretation that gives it meaning.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to challenge the provider's interpretations. Ask probing questions like, what other factors might be influencing these results? Or, are there any alternative explanations we should consider?
So it's about bringing your own critical thinking to the table, making sure you're not just passively accepting the provider's conclusions.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, you know your business better than anyone. Your insights and perspectives are crucial to extracting meaningful and actionable findings from that data.
Okay, now let's talk about quality control. How can our listeners ensure that the research is being conducted rigorously and that the insights are reliable?
Good question. Transparency is key here. Don't hesitate to ask about the provider's quality assurance processes.
Like, what specific questions should we be asking?
Ask how they ensure data accuracy, what measures they have in place to minimize bias in data collection and analysis. Do they have independent review processes, things like that?
So it's like peeking behind the curtain to understand the mechanisms that ensure the integrity of the final product.
Exactly. And if you're working on a large-scale or particularly complex project, consider requesting access to raw data sets or interim reports.
Okay.
That allows you to track progress, verify findings, and make sure everything is aligned with your expectations.
So it's about staying informed and involved throughout the entire research journey, not just at the beginning and end.
That's right. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into procuring market research services, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Myers.
Successful market research procurement isn't just about ticking boxes and following a formula. It's about embracing the spirit of partnership, curiosity, continuous learning.
It's about viewing market research as an ongoing investment in understanding your customers, your market, and ultimately making smarter business decisions.
Precisely. And remember, even the most seasoned market research professionals are constantly learning and evolving. So stay curious, ask questions, and never stop seeking those aha moments that can transform your business.
That's a fantastic takeaway. I think we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise and insights.
My pleasure.
To our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive valuable, and we'll catch you next time for another insightful exploration.